Okay, why don't you start
Okay,
with the next
great.
question?
Right. So, yes, coming back, next question from Asta, and it's about Tesla and Volkswagen. So, would you think that they would be able to collaborate, learn from each other, or even co-create to strengthen their competitive advantages, given that they seem to have some degree of complementing capabilities?
Yeah, well, let me try to answer that. Yes, they do have some complementary capabilities, but they're also now head-to-head competitors. Tesla, I mean, I'd say 2 years ago, there was a greater chance of that than now. The challenge that Tesla has is it is still not built, cars in volume. I forget the numbers it was making until recently, 10, 20,000 cars a year. I think, what is it, up 50, 60, 70,000 cars a year. This is still a drop in the bucket compared to a million or 2 million cars a year. On the other hand, it's now in record time opened a factory in China. And I think it's building another, it's got the Fremont facility here, just 20 miles down the road from UC Berkeley. So it does need a partner to scale with, to build cars. And there's an opportunity there, whether, but I think, Volkswagen, General Motors, Ford, Toyota, Nissan could all be partners for Tesla. So I think the question is, what would Tesla be willing to do for Volkswagen? And there, maybe it's licensing its architecture, maybe with respect to autonomous vehicles, different autonomous vehicles, different LiDARs, LiDAR, LIDAR is the thing on the top. Maybe there's going to be a need for a certain amount of standardization in terms of being able to recognize other vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a standardization process which is already taking place to some degree, but there certainly is room for cooperation in the industry that would benefit everybody around standards, and that's already partly in progress. But I think that the main benefit, there'd be more benefit to Tesla than there would be to Volkswagen, I would think. Certainly Volkswagen could make a high quality vehicle to Tesla standards, no doubt about that. But it would sort of put Volkswagen in a commodity type position, whereas Volkswagen doesn't want to be in a commodity-like position. No one wants to be in a commodity-like position. So there's probably room for a deal there. And let's wait and see. Maybe there will be a deal there with Toyota. There's certainly been speculation that Tesla will find a partner. And no doubt there's plenty of people that would like to be partners with Tesla at this point.
All right, great. Next, from earlier chat from Himant is, what do you think of the idea that we're heading into a world of transportation as a service?
I think in the cities, that's probably the case. There's a generational difference here. I certainly don't plan to use transportation as a service, and I expect to be self-driving because I like driving. BMW presents itself as the ultimate driving machine. Well, that branding doesn't look so great anymore, does it? Because if you got a driverless car, well, maybe actually it is, because the niche that's going to be left for BMW is the people that still like to drive. And there'll always be a good chunk of people that still like to drive. Although I understand a lot of Gen Xers don't know how to drive, let alone it's not like that. They have no enjoyment in it and have no knowledge of how to do it. On the other hand, we saw hundreds of millions of Chinese suddenly learn how to drive cars, although not very well. So the question is, do people enjoy driving cars? And the answer is some part of the time, yes. So I think you're going to see a bifurcated circumstance where the ownership model will continue, but at the same time, it will become a service for certainly in the cities and probably for 70% of transportation by land. That would be my guess. Now that's, we've seen there was no rental market for cars initially, and then, the rental industry is quite significant now. I think transportation as a service goes one additional step, and then the integration between driving and rail and airlines and so forth is going to naturally fit into that, and maybe easier when it's provided as a service than if you own your own car.
All right. Next from Corey, can you speak to shaping, as in between seizing and transforming?
Can I speak to shaping?
Shaping, yes.
How do you spell that?
SHAPING. It's referenced earlier as,
can I speak to shaping
from sensing, seizing, shaping, and transforming.
Okay, shaping. Well, yes, let me speak to shaping. That's a very, very good question. And this is where the whole adaptation school of thinking breaks down, because what I've said with dynamic capable is not just adapting to everybody else, it's shaping what everybody else does. Now, how do you shape what other people do? It's through standardization, whether that's formal standardization through standard setting bodies, or I'll call it informal or market standardization. So let's take Henry Ford. Henry Ford shaped the automobile industry. How did he do that? One, he came up with a design for a low-cost car, and that design had, engine in the front, 4 wheels, not 3, steering wheel, not a steering bar, internal combustion, not steam or electric, and then he geared up to make that. He standardized on that and geared up to make it at volume, and got the economies of mass production. So everybody, initially, and remember, initially, even in the United States of America, some cars had the steering wheel on the left and some had it on the right. And no one can tell you, by the way, if you're interested in this, no one can tell you how it ended up on the side that it is. There was no standard setting body. It was done through the marketplace. And even when most cars were left-hand drive, there was still some, they weren't imports from the UK, there was some made in America that were on the right. If you go look at cars in the early 20s, you'll find that's true. So standardization through the market, standardization through regulatory and standard setting process is another. And I said regulatory and standard setting. I mean, just think of autonomous cars. There's going to be, it's going to go first in China because there's a central authority that's going to say all the freeways are going to look the following way and have the same signage, and there's, whether it's not a freeway or whether it's a local road, whatever, the standards will come down from on top. Sometimes there's a benefit to having an authoritarian structure that imposes things. So the way that private industry does that is to try and influence the regulator or try and shape the standards in a cooperative way and in a positive way. So shaping can come through the regulation, through standardization, and through just simply creating the product. I mean, in a way, the iPhone set the standard for what a high quality mobile phone was to look like. It was no longer a clamshell. It was, a screen. I mean, when you come up with a dominant design, you shape the industry. So that's a very good question. you know, the irony is it's not just the big guys that can shape, it's the little guys that can shape too. You could shape as a little guy by not through muscle, but by creating something iconic that everybody wants to copy or mimic or imitate or emulate in some fashion.
Great. Okay, so there were a couple of raised hands earlier. It looked like those had gone down. If there's anyone else who I might have missed or who has another question, now's the time. I think we're good to continue.
Okay, well, so just to review where we're at, we've been through sensing and sense making, seizing and transforming. And I managed to do that without using the word strategy. And we know that strategy is an important part of the whole decision.
Well, we'll look into what's going on. One sec. Okay, IT is looking into it. Just a sec. I might be talking to them offline, so I am intentionally muting myself. One sec.
Okay.
All right, Ian, can you hear us?
Yes, back. Good. You're muted.
Are we muted, Ian?
I can hear you. Although
You can
the
hear us
video
now.
mic,
Perfect.
okay,
Yeah.
you're back.
Perfect.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Ian can see me, but I can see Christian Matheson and Dan Andres. Can you raise your hand? Yes, you can hear me, right, Christian? Oh, thank you very much. Okay, we're good to go.
Thank you.
So, good strategy is an integral part of dynamic capability. So, what is a strategy? So let's just stop, because this is one of the most overused words in business, strategy. What the heck is it? What is it not? You know, I've told you dynamic capabilities is not ordinary capabilities. With strategy, a strategy is not a goal, okay? Winning a war is not a strategy. How you go about winning the war is a strategy. So it's usually the indirect way you use to win a war or to get something done. So, you know, if I can use a very bad example, but one that you'll maybe remember, when the British bombed Dresden in the Second World War, Dresden was not a military target, but it was to try and crush the spirit of Germany. And, you know, both American and British planes firebombed Germany. But it was an indirect way to try and win on the battlefield. And you know, it's considerable ethical discussion and debate on that for many years, that appropriately show. So a good strategy is a specific and coherent response to an approach to overcoming the obstacles to progress. That's, I'm borrowing from my good friend Dick Ramel. And that's as good a definition of strategy as I can come up with. A good strategy is a specific and coherent response, an approach to overcoming the obstacles to progress. And then a bad strategy is a list of blue sky goals or fluff and buzzword infected vision that everybody's supposed to share. Dick is a very acerbic individual, and he has no trouble putting down executives who don't know what strategy is. And all you have to do is read annual reports. And they'll say, well, my strategy is to win the North American market. Well, that's utter nonsense. That's not a strategy, that's a goal. Or my strategy is to become a global competitor. It's not a strategy, that's a goal. So as simple as this is, I guarantee you, you'll find 2 out of 3 people misusing the word strategy. And so I want to be careful with you folks around what it is. And I'll follow Ramel here to say there's 3 buckets of things. Just like there's 3 buckets of things for dynamic capabilities, there's 3 related buckets for strategy. There's diagnosis, which is close to, but not the same as sensing and sense making. A guiding policy. So with respect to decisions, you got to be clear about what it is you're doing, and your action has to be coherent. You can't be pulling and pushing at the same time. So with that definition of strategy, let's see how it relates to dynamic capabilities. My first point is that, and I've already mentioned this term congruence. Things have to fit together. So if you've got any purpose and design around an organization, it has to be coherent. And this is really a notion from systems theory. Any physical system has to be coherent, and any social system has to be coherent to get high performance. Systems theory views organizations as social systems that must be aligned if the organization is to be effective. And by the way, it turns out that UC Berkeley and the Haas Business School, it wasn't the Haas Business School at the time, but back in the 50s and 60s, Berkeley, and particularly the business school, the School of Business Administration, was the hotbed for systems thinking. And systems thinking is very, very important. And it's disappeared from academia because it's untidy. Well, not untidy, it's hard, it's interdisciplinary. So people don't focus on systems thinking very much in schools of management anymore. There's still, engineers still talk about systems and systems theory. If you want to course on systems theory, you probably have to go to an engineering school. But it should be the business school that's teaching systems. And I guess today we're mentioning systems, even if we're not really teaching a full course on it. Two quite well-known management scholars, Nadler and Tushman, brought this notion of organizational alignment into the literature and into consulting parlance. They actually had a little company that was focused on organizational alignment. And really the idea today kind of lives in the concept of business models. We know that for a business model, you have to have the components, in a way that are complementary and not competitive with each other. I mean, you can't have a high cost of production and a low price in the market. I mean, that's, an obvious element of congruence. You have to have, you can't be pushing and pulling at the same time. So that's the broad notion of coherence that Ramel is referring to. And let's now start to put together this notion of strategy, that you've got some design to your overall purpose with capabilities. And I do so here at the simplest of level by taking, classic narratives, David and Goliath. Who is the strongest? Is it David or Goliath? Well, clearly it's Goliath. Who wins? It's David. Why does David win? Because he has a strategy. What's the strategy? Which is go to the weak point of Goliath, which is I'll get a stone and hit him in the temple and I'll kill him. So he's got a slingshot that hits Goliath in the temple, and the little guy beats the big guy. In some fundamental sense, that is strategy. If you're in a yacht race and your boat's not quite as fast, you're not going to win by following the fast boat around and exactly its course. You're going to take a different course and hope for different winds. But if you get the same winds as the slightly faster boat and you're going to go parallel with them or go toe to toe with them, it ain't going to work. And every sailor knows that. So here is one of the most powerful cases of where strategy won. And this is the Battle of Trafalgar. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because even the military historians sometimes get this wrong. Everybody uses this to demonstrate the importance of strategy. So let me take you back in history to 1805, and the Spaniards and the French were the enemies of the British, and I forget what they were trying to do at this point. I don't think they're going to invade the Isles, but anyway, there was the three navies met off the coast of Spain. The combined French and Spanish navies were considerably larger than the British. So remember, in those days, the way that you fought at sea was broadsides. So you'd have cannons and the ships would go alongside and fire at each other. And usually the Navy with the most ships would win. So if you're the Navy with the smallest ships, you're not going to go along broadside. You've got to think of a different strategy. So what Lord Nelson did was essentially T-bone, and you're coming in from the left with these vertical columns, T-bone the French and the Spanish fleets. Now, at first, this looks like a silly thing to do, because think how vulnerable you are when you approach with this T-bone pattern, because you've only got 2 cannons in the front. You got 6 or 8 or 10 along the side. So why don't you go a beam where you can use all your cannons? Well, obviously, Lord Nelson, he wasn't Lord Nelson at the time, he got to be Lord Nelson because he won the battle. He died in the battle, but he won the battle. Had a different goal, which was, he knew that his ships were a little smaller and a little more agile, and he knew that the British gunners could load and reload faster than the French and the Spaniards. So he had agility on his side. And so what he was trying to do here is to break the chain of command and to create chaos on the water. If he could create chaos on the water, then you could, one of these little ships could pick off two larger Spanish and French ships. And that's exactly what he did. So he came at it in this T-bone fashion. He had the benefit of surprise, and the command and control system of the French and the Spaniards broke down. And the subsequent ensuing chaos on the water, the British won. That strategy, but it's not just strategy by itself, it's strategy matched to capabilities. It's strategy matched to capabilities. So that's the message I want you to draw from this, and shouldn't apologize for using a military history for strategy, because that's where the whole field of strategy began in the first place. We're just using elements of strategic thinking in business, but it really has its origins in the military. So the takeaway that I want to give you here is that capabilities are important to value creation and capability and capture, and need to be part of strategy, but also capabilities need to drive strategy through achieving coherence and alignment. So there's these 2 things have to be thought of holistically. And I knew that when I wrote the original paper, but I didn't pay any attention to it in the paper. And people reading the paper today will see those, it's like scrambled eggs. That's what makes that original, those of you that might have tried to read that original 1997 paper, it happens to be the most cited paper in all of business and economics today, believe it or not. But it's scrambled eggs in terms of strategy and capabilities being mixed up, and I'm trying to unscramble them for purposes, for pedagogic purposes, not for suggesting that in practice you think about them separately. It's merely for pedagogic or teaching purposes. Now, some companies do think holistically, I've got a quote here from Chairman Zhang of Haier Corporation. Haier, by the way, is the largest producer of refrigerators and air conditioners in the world today. It bought GE appliances in the United States, so it's got a big North American footprint. It bought Fisher & Paykel in Australia and New Zealand, and has a very large footprint in China. So this company's come from nothing to the largest producer of refrigerators and air conditioners in the world. And Chairman Zhang, who was there at the beginning, by the way, I guess it proves you can go from the entrepreneur to leading a large organization, and now he's trying to transform it. But he says, we tend to look at things from a holistic perspective, so we are applying traditional holistic thinking to our management. That's consistent with dynamic capabilities. And I don't find too many CEOs talking like this. That's why I had to go to China to find, a successful CEO saying the things that I think need to be said. So here are the 3 things that need to work together to build long-term competitive advantage of the business enterprise. So, let's go back to the last class. I said the whole essence of strategic management is building for the long term, building and sustaining competitive advantage, which is a point of difference that leads to superior long-run returns and continuous growth and prosperity. And so there's dynamic capabilities themselves, but it's really the integration of these three things: capabilities, both ordinary and dynamic, and strategy. And I kind of use the cogs here to show they got to work together. You don't want these things clashing and grinding. They got to work together. And I'm sure there's a graphical artist who can show it somewhat better than I've been able to do. But this is a general point, and these are very big points. But I can guarantee you can look at most companies today and you'll find that either they're missing a few cogs, or they're not working together very well, or if they're working together, it's not well oiled. So, by the way, it's taken me 20 years to come up with this, but this is a diagram that sort of tries to show where the sweet spot is for management. And the sweet spot is, in a VUCA world, is C1. So where you have ordinary capabilities that are strong, you have dynamic capabilities that are strong, and you have good strategy. In this diagram, the only place where they overlap is C1. Now, what I've also said is, and I don't know how to draw this, but you can get away with weak dynamic capabilities if you are not in a world of deep uncertainty. There still may be some nooks and crannies in the economy where you're shielded from deep uncertainty, and so you could get away with C2 with strong ordinary capabilities and good strategy. But if you're in a world of change, then you're going to need the dynamic capabilities as well. So let me just pause there, because that's the little strategy module, and that diagram that you have up there is showing the sweet spot, and it's not just good to have. It's a must-have for long-term competitive advantage. So I bet you can show the companies that fail, of which there are many, are ones that don't have any intersection between those three circles. So Ian, let's check to see if we've got any hands up or any questions before we move on to the alternative paradigm. So what I've given you now in a nutshell is the dynamic capabilities framework. From here on in the class, it's going to be elaborating this thing and making you believe it, and giving you the tools to use it. But this is the essence of it so far. And I'll only be able to convince you how different and better it is by showing you how limited a lot of the other frameworks are that you might want to use for the same purpose. So let's pause to see if we've got any questions.
All right, it doesn't look like anything in the chat or raised hands. So if anyone has a question on this section, feel free to go ahead.
Did you say there are no questions?
Correct.
I have a quick
so
question.
Yeah, go ahead
guess-
if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Regina. I'm an
Right.
alumni auditor. This final slide, I just have a little trouble. It's so conceptual, like the seizing, sensing, transforming made a lot of sense to me. Is there a way to kind of bring this to life a little bit? Because it just feels very conceptual to me. I'm trying to look at all the circles.
Well, so there's two things I'm doing there. First of all, I'm saying that dynamic capabilities are every firm has some amount of them, but you can be weak or strong. In fact, it's really an ordinal scale. You could be rate you from 1 to 10. But what I'm saying is that I'm trying to find the competitive advantage. And I'm saying you need all three of these things. You need strong dynamic capabilities, strong ordinary capabilities, and good strategy to have a firm that is a well-managed firm. So you've got to be in C1, except for if the world is not uncertain. So
That helped. I didn't know where to look.
It's my first shot at this diagram. Actually, we're all well aware that a diagram can really be a very powerful thing. So this is new. This one is only 1 week old. So you're the first people to be exposed to it. And I can already see a weakness in it, which is, the dynamic capabilities is there's no intersection between to tell you what happens if you've got weak dynamic capabilities, but you're strong at everything else. So there's already a conceptual error, structural error, an architectural error in the diagram, but I haven't figured out how to fix it yet.
Okay, that helps.
By the way, I'll take assistance from anyone on this and find a way to give you attribution. Well, to throw some fuel on the fire, let me now walk into the lion's mouth. And the dominant paradigm in business schools, and I would say in practice, well, not the dominant paradigm in practice, because there are so many paradigms of strategic management, is Michael Porter's 5 forces. For 30 years, I've been saying that this is not a guide, not a good guide for decision making. And I believe that it's an industrial era model that everybody at Harvard still gets taught this stuff. And it was maybe suitable for the United States in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but is no longer appropriate for a world of deep uncertainty, a world where there's any technological change. But it's the kind of stuff that's not just through the textbooks, but many business schools still teach it. So I'm assuming you all know what the 5 forces model is, but I want to explain to you how what I've just presented you with is completely antithetical to this other framework. So if you, in my class, use the 5 forces model as an exemplar of how you do good strategic management, I might give you a failing grade, and I suspect Professor Porter would give you a failing grade for omitting 5 forces and focusing on dynamic capabilities. But that's not the issue here. I want you to understand what the conventional wisdom is, because the conventional wisdom, in my view, is wrong. And if you've been swimming along with me so far and been sort of nodding your heads, and I haven't seen too much commitment in that regard, then you have to agree with me that what they teach at Harvard is unhelpful and possibly quite wrong in many circumstances, although I will find a way at the end to say where it fits in. So the approach to strategy at the Harvard Business School, they don't mention capabilities, certainly not dynamic capabilities. But the whole idea is that strategy is about finding the right industry. Go find an attractive industry. That's where you can build competitive advantage. And the way you build competitive advantage, you go find an attractive industry, and then you build barriers to entry of some kind. And then you sit and shield behind the barriers to entry, and you make quasi-monopoly profits, and the shareholders are happy, and so is everybody else. That's what you learn at the Harvard Business School. So the 5 forces are the threat of new entry. You want to avoid that. You don't want to be in a circumstance where the bargaining power of suppliers is high. You want to be where bargaining power of suppliers is weak. You want to have the bargaining power of the customer to be weak as well. By the way, it's misspelled. I apologize. And that you don't want to have any threat of substitutes, and you don't want intensity of rivalry. You want everyone to be fat and happy and not too competitive. The no discussion beyond that about individual firms. It's all strategies from the outside in. It's about finding the right spot in the industry. You find the right spot, and the dinner bell rings, or the cash register rings, is perhaps a better way to put it. That's what they teach at Harvard. That's what most consulting firms teach in one way or another, and that's the dominant paradigm, to the extent to which there's a dominant paradigm that's taught in the field of strategy. It's not the dominant paradigm in research. The dominant paradigm in research today is dynamic capabilities, I'm pleased to say. But in terms of impacting the curriculum of business schools around the world, most business schools are still 30 years behind, or close to 40 years behind now, and have some version of Porter's 5 forces. So what's wrong with it? One, it's static. There's no innovation in it, and there's no reference to uncertainty. So it's not a world that, you know, we can recognize in Silicon Valley. And in fact, when Porter first published this stuff in the 1980s, and I was out here in California, needless to say, I shrugged my shoulders. I said, well, this is for yesterday's world, not for today's world. And it's actually based on work in economics that came out of Berkeley in the 1930s and 1940s. We had a professor here called Joe Bain, B-A-I-N. He happened to be an alcoholic in his later years, but he was on the Berkeley campus in the 50s and 60s. And if you go to the Berkeley Library, you can find, no one goes to the library to look at books anymore, but his book called Industrial Organization was the textbook of the day globally. And what Michael Porter did was take this Joe Bain type work based on looking at industries in the industrial era, and he came to this conclusion that what industry analysis was and what good strategy was finding an attractive industry. So the problem is it's static and it's backward looking, and it defines the competitive arena by industry, not by markets, not by ecosystem, and there's no reference to capabilities. So you don't take into account your own capabilities or the capabilities of competitors. So other than the fact that it's static, backward looking, and defines the wrong competitive arena, it's just fine. But believe it or not, some version of this is what is still dominant. Clearly, no one could teach this stuff if you are anywhere near the Bay Area or anywhere near a high-tech hub. And of course, Massachusetts is now a high-tech hub, but it hasn't seemed to dent the enthusiasm for this type of industrial age thinking. So let me go on a little bit further here. This is me being a little bit flippant. So the picture is the easy life that comes from finding an attractive industry and enjoying the easy life, being protected by barriers to entry. What's the point of view I've been giving you so far? First of all, we haven't even mentioned the term industry. Well, we've talked about the auto industry maybe, but industry is not a central part of the analysis of the dynamic capabilities. Dynamic capabilities looks at your capabilities, it looks at your competitors' capabilities, and in sensing and sense making, yes, you got to be looking out at a competitive arena, but we don't say just sense and just do your sense making inside the industry. Why not? Well, if Netflix had taken that point of view, where would they be? What are industry boundaries? I don't know what an industry is anymore. Industry is a creation of statistical authorities. They're not representative of industry boundaries or competitive boundaries in any meaningful sense, particularly in the digital world. I will go so far as to say, just drop the word industry, and you'll be better off. There aren't industry boundaries anymore that are meaningful. There are national boundaries that are meaningful, In that sense, maybe geographic markets may exist, but in terms of industrial boundaries, they were always blurry and artificial, even in the past, and that's certainly true today. So my first bullet point is industry boundaries don't matter. That's what distinguishes the dynamic capabilities worldview. Second bullet there, we sense current and future user customer needs, your existing and future capabilities, and you find new combination of assets and embed them within a business model that's viable. That's sort of the direction of travel. There's nothing to say you look at industry entry barriers. That's not part of the story. Why not? Because industry entry barriers don't exist. There are barriers to competition, but those barriers to competition are not set by industry boundaries. They're set by the difficulty of replicating capabilities. They're set sometimes by intellectual property rights. They're set sometimes by contractual rights, but they're not set by industry boundaries. And then the third bullet there is weed out that which doesn't align, build the capabilities for the future you expect. None of that comes out of Porter's framework. In fact, business firms don't really exist. He doesn't focus on the capabilities of organizations at all. He doesn't focus on the ordinary capabilities, let alone the dynamic capabilities. So the focus of dynamic capabilities is on organizational capabilities. And then in dynamic capabilities, we say only the paranoid survive. This is quoting, of course, Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. So stay paranoid. Because why do you stay paranoid? Because of uncertainty. You don't know who your competitor is tomorrow. It may not be the same as your competitor today. And you know all of these things that fit under our mantra, you know that's correct because you live and work in Silicon Valley. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But what you need to know is, and that maybe it's part of your competitive benefit, a good chunk of the world and a good chunk of managers and a good many consultants are still stuck up top there in this five forces view that it's industry competitive conditions that shape your future, not the capabilities of organizations. So clearly I don't have high regard for this framework. I don't know, let me maybe just pause to, this is a big enough point that before we go on, let's see what the next slide is. Well, it's a little bit repetitive. So let me just finish this, even if it's a bit repetitive, before I pause, because this is a huge point. What we're saying is that Harvard MBAs, to the extent to which this is their bread and butter, have either got it wrong or we've got it wrong. So in Porter's view, good industries and finding good and bad industries are your North Star. So, you know, today, is the automobile industry a good industry or a bad industry? Is cable television a good industry or a bad industry? Is education a good industry or a bad industry? Is coffee a good industry or a bad industry? Are these meaningful questions to ask? I don't think so. And how do you think about corporate strengths? You know, in the Porter view of the world, you look at market share. So a strong company is one with a big market share. In the capabilities framework, market share is a reflection of the capabilities you had yesterday. It's not a reflection of your capabilities today or your capabilities tomorrow. So companies are not defined by market shares or the markets are addressing, but by the capabilities that they have and the capabilities that they're building. And dynamic capabilities is not just about leveraging existing capabilities, it's more focused on what are the ones I need to build for the future. That's the orientation. So the dynamic capabilities framework doesn't really focus you on competitors. And let me give you a great quote. I should have it up here from Jeff Bezos. Someone asked him, how much competitive analysis do you do? You know what his answer was? None. There's only one thing he focuses on, and that is the customer. Now, I believe that he was genuine when he said none, and that all he's focused on, and this is actually in their financial, well, it's more or less in their annual reports. They focus on one thing and one thing only, which is giving the customer the best possible experience. And we know this is what their focus is. I mean, everybody knows that. You know, and maybe he's occasionally looking over his shoulder to see what somebody else might be doing in the online world. But he's focused laser-like on the customer experience. Whereas if you go to the Harvard Business School and take Michael Porter's course, you're focused on finding the right industries. These are hugely different perspectives of the world. And in my view, you know, discount the value of that type of knowledge. And I think most great companies, yes, you kind of need to be generally aware of the competition, but when you're truly a trailblazer, you're not thinking about competition at all. If you're a trailblazer. Now, I'm not saying, I mean, Google clearly looked across at Apple, and when Apple did the iPhone and decided that, you know, they needed to build an ecosystem to compete. So Google was looking across at Apple, but ultimately, I think the big tech companies are focused on customers, and they're not looking at industry barriers, and they're not looking at particular competitors. They're really looking at how can they produce something that's going to generate more revenue, and so industries certainly don't matter, and competitors do matter, but they're less important than creating a great customer experience and creating a customer solution. If you can create a customer solution that's better than anybody else's, you don't have to worry about the competitor too much unless the competitor can do the same thing. Capabilities-driven strategies recognize that you don't need to be the first mover. Remember the IBM 360 story, as I told you. IBM was the last one into the game of building mainframe computers, what came to be known as mainframe computers. Sperry Rand had a 3-year head start. It was Watson who bet the company on it. Google, likewise, was not the first search engine. There was Lycos, there was Alta Vista, there was Yahoo, there was Ask Jeeves. They all preceded Google. But Google, you know, had a better algorithm to start with. Capabilities-driven strategies also pay way less attention to physical assets and way more attention to intangible assets. And a capability isn't intangible assets. So everything that's on, you don't find you know, and if you look at a company's balance sheet, you don't find a line item for capabilities, do you? You only find a line item for plant and equipment and things that you can measure. That's why balance sheets are not particularly helpful, because most of the assets that matter are intangibles. And that's something to bear in mind as well. And capabilities can appreciate or they can depreciate. If you have rapid learning, you have capabilities that are improving. And you can learn by doing, you can learn by using, you can learn by experimenting. There's all kinds of different ways you can learn. So capabilities-driven strategies pay a lot of attention to intangible assets and almost no attention to tangible assets other than cash. But let me just pause. Let me just go back. This is too much to go over all at once. First of all, I'm assuming here that all of you have had some exposure to the five forces model. You know, I know we have some alums. We've got some practitioners in the audience here, and I would guess that at least half the class, don't know for sure, has had exposure to Michael Porter's Competitive Strategies book, which is about these five forces that supposedly should shape the strategies of firms and supposedly lead to competitive advantage. So before we go any further, I think I need to pause to ask you, am I shortchanging Professor Porter? Or has he missed something associated with the competitive environment that we've all been living in for the last 35 years? Let's see if we get any hands on that one.
You can go ahead if you'd like.
Professor, hi, this is Raju. Again, I kind of understand what you're trying to explain here with dynamic capabilities. And I have to admit, I mean, I've used the Porter's five forces because that's the one we're being taught at during MBAs, right? But I kind of agree with you. The drawback with the five forces was, what do you do after that, right? Yeah, you enter a market which is attractive, but what do you do after that? It doesn't really focus on that. But is there a middle ground where you take Porter's five forces first, you do the analysis, and then how to stay competitive and how to differentiate and how to bring value to go with dynamic capability? Is it possible to find that middle ground?
Well, to be fair to Professor Porter, the course he teaches at Harvard is called Industry Analysis. Now, I don't know why anyone would sign up for a course for something which doesn't exist. Industries don't exist. They haven't existed for a long time. But nevertheless, the MBAs at Harvard will still flock to the class of industry analysis. And as you point out, that you've used it to kind of assess the attractiveness of an area of competition. Call it an industry, call it what you want. So in a way, it's part of the sensing operation. If you want to push five forces in to dynamic capabilities, you can say, well, okay, it's to help you understand the business environment. And that's what sensing is. I use the word sensing because it's way more general. It doesn't say you sense using five forces. Dynamic capability, you sense with everything you've got. You not only look at the market, you look at also at government policy. You look not only at competition, you look at emerging technologies that are not in the market. If you're looking in the market, you're not looking in the right place. You should be looking maybe in universities because that's where new technology comes from. You may be looking in government labs, or you may be looking for, for other forces at work that are going to affect competition. So it's a much more open-ended thing. In some sense, like industry analysis is the old story of the old man looking under a lamppost, for his car keys, and someone says, "Why are you looking here?" He says, "Well, because that's where I can see." When industry is a place where you can see, but it's not necessarily where the keys are. The keys may be somewhere else. So, taking you to the industry and focus you on the five forces misses the plot, in my view. It circumscribes the search process too much for today's world. If you're Disney, Disney did Disney understand that Netflix was a competitor? Did they understand that 5 years ago? I mean, it looked at first like Netflix was someone who had helped distribute Disney movies, right? But next minute your complement, it becomes your competitor. it's all topsy-turvy. The old concepts, the old constructs are wrong and they're misleading. So, in some sense, those Chinese executives have a benefit because they haven't suffered from some of this stuff coming out of American business schools. It's been wrong for too long. Why is it wrong for too long? Because professors like to teach what they know, and they don't always know stuff that's consistent with what's really going on in the world. Anyway, thank you for that comment. It was good. At least you admitted you'd used the framework, and I'd really created a difficult environment for anyone to ask a question. So thank you for being brave.
Yep, thank you.
All right, next
Any
up
other
we
questions?
have, Andrew, followed by Jackie. Andrew, do you want to go ahead?
For sure. Thanks, Ian. Professor, I guess hearing you kind of describe the differences between Porter's 5 forces and dynamic capabilities, it's starting to click in my mind that, I had the strategy professor for Haas that talks about the environmental or biological perspective, right? And dynamic capability seems much more aligned with that, in that, like, it takes the perspective of the organization or organism and says, what do you have? How do you adapt to the environment around you, rather than kind of looking for one that fits best and trying to migrate over there?
Well, yes. In fact, one of the alternative paradigms that we're going to talk about in due course is evolutionary economics, and using the biological metaphor. Yeah, so let's just talk about that briefly. This is a little bit closer to evolution, an evolutionary view of organizations than Porter doesn't have any view of organizations because he's only looking at markets, right? There's no firm in the 5 forces. There are some companies out there called competitors, but there's no description of organizations or organizational decision-making issues and so forth that we have here. But let's come back to the biological metaphor. Organizations are a bit like species. They don't change very rapidly. Yes, you get evolution, but it takes place in the animal world very slowly. And in the business world, evolution has to be on steroids. So, and in a truly evolutionary framework, there's no decisions. Your genetic structure essentially determines what you can do. You're limited to what you can do. You can't take a plant that, survives in sunlight and put it deep in the forest and expect it to live. So what I say with dynamic capability is that this is evolution and design. It's got the hand of management on it, but there are the constraints. There are the constraints of the existing organization. Remember, when we're talking about transformation, I said that sometimes companies are in an iron cage. That's a metaphor that's being used. The iron cage notion says, look, organizations are not completely fungible. Particularly old, well-established, and successful organizations are the least fungible. Organizations that are failing, you've got a somewhat better chance because everyone's very worried. They know they've got to change or the company's gone. But successful organizations are the most vulnerable, and that's where leadership comes in. When you tell successful people that, hey, we're doing things wrong, that's a steep road. That's a steep mountain to climb. But we'll explore the limits of the evolutionary model because, there's this whole notion of path dependency that, you can't change the tiger's stripes. That's the biological view. But what we're saying here is that good managers can change the tiger's stripes. Some people say it's not possible. I will say it is possible. And you see it every day. The best companies in Silicon Valley are chameleons, and they change with reasonable speed. But the old ones, and look at Intel now. Intel's in a difficult, it's the oldest companies in Silicon Valley, and it's falling behind in terms of being able to get to the frontier where it's always been in the past with respect to line width. And it's the end of Moore's law. They've been riding on the back of Moore's Law for 35 years. Where do they go now? For 40 years, maybe. They need a strategy as well as a change in capabilities. And yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, let's see. Jackie, did you still have a question, or was that answered?
Yeah, I do. Hi, I'm Jackie. I work in relationship management at Standard & Poor's, which is a very large and very old company. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Professor, on how companies can move tactically from kind of more Porter's five forces model that's been built on industry analysis to this dynamic capabilities model, having a large bureaucracy in place. What are some ways to do that other than really just disassembling what's there and from scratch?
Ian, the audio was very bad for me. You're wearing headphones. Can you repeat that or summarize it maybe?
Yeah, actually, Jackie, could you repeat that? Or
Yeah, can you hear me a little bit better?
Not
barely. Can you get any closer to the mic?
Yeah, how's that?
We can try that. Yeah, go ahead.
What I was saying was, I work in relationship management at Standard & Poor's, which is a very large and old corporation. And so I'm curious to hear some ways that companies can kind of tactically move from this Porter's five forces model that's focused on industry analysis to a model that's more focused on capabilities, having these large bureaucracies in place without kind of disassembling what's there and starting from scratch.
Ian, can you try that again? The audio was still confounding for me.
Yeah, sure. So working in a large organization, how to move from working with Porter's five forces into a dynamic capabilities framework.
Okay. I think what you have to do is say the world changed from the world that Porter's describing a long time ago, and that you've got to re-engineer. You've got to use a different cognitive framework. Yeah, that's the way to put it. You need a different cognitive framework, one that recognizes deep uncertainty. Deep uncertainty. And the reason why, before I got into sensing, seizing, and transforming, I went through all that preamble about what happens with deep uncertainty. Well, what happens is when you can't predict. The business plan isn't worth much, and maybe you can try scenario planning. There's no one business plan that's going to work. It's hard to use the classical instruments of financial assessment around new opportunities. So you need a different cognitive framework. And you've got to begin by building the vocabulary around capabilities, both your own capabilities and the capabilities of your competitors. So a capabilities framework will have you focused on understanding your own business environment, understanding the limitations of your own organizations and what it has to do in order to execute properly. And it's a lot more inside driven. It sees the problems of strategy as being more inside the company than outside. So you take the case of Amazon, and it's really some people would have disbelief if you said, if Bezos stand up and said, I really don't care about competitors. He's been saying this for a long time. I focus on one thing and one thing only. A lot of people think he's lying. I don't. I think he's probably worried about government. That's his main worry right now. But is he worried about competitors? No, not just because it's big, but I would say from the very beginning, he's not worried about competitors because he's being a pioneer. If you're a true pioneer, it's not the competitor that'll kill you. It's your own inability to execute on the vision. So the framework that I'm putting out here is diametrically different, and it requires a different mental model. And And that requires that you abandon, if you haven't had exposure to the Porter framework, in some sense, you're better off, except for it's helpful to understand the Porter model because you know when somebody else on the team says something consistent with the Porter framework, you know where they may be getting it from. And I find that incredibly useful. When I'm listening to people, when they say things, it's a combination of the facts and the experiences they've had in their cognitive frameworks. If you, in a team environment, can sort out why someone's coming to a conclusion different from yours and the role of their cognitive framework, you're then in a position to, first of all, check your own cognitive framework to see if it's right, but to quiz them on their cognitive framework and see if you're disagreeing because of the cognitive framework or because there's different information. And I think you'll find that a very useful tool. Are there any other questions, Ian?
Yes, let's see, from Dan. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so it's more of a, I guess, a comment, because you asked about commenting on Porter, and sorry for the language I'm about to use because this is a direct quote. When I was young in marketing, the vice president of the firm I was at was actually quoted as saying, basically I was told to be prepared with slides when I went into the meeting, make sure I have a lot of data, because the vice president was quoted as saying, anyone who comes in without data is just another asshole with an opinion. He's probably one of the reasons why I left the company and then went to work for 2 startups. And so what you're saying is very applicable. I'm also a stock speculator, and I guess the comments that I'm sure you probably know Catherine Wood, and if there's probably anyone that's been able to monetize what you're talking about, it seems to be her and ARK Investments. So, and she basically talks about how she looks for companies to invest in that are going to change the world and are really doing things differently. Are you familiar with her and her style?
No. Please email me that. I will take a look, because I am a bit of a contrarian when it comes to investment, because I think the dynamic capabilities framework gives you a bit of a contrarian perspective on things, and it enables you to both understand real organizations and as well as understand a little bit investor perspectives, because investors are a lot smarter than most researchers, I suppose, but investors sometimes get locked in yesterday's mindset as well. And I don't think anything that I'm saying in this class is and everybody in Silicon Valley understands it, but not everybody in the investment world understands it. And you see that when they analyze companies like Ericsson that have got large amounts of intellectual property and intangible assets. I mean, there's too much financial analysis that goes on, and I guess it comes back to your first comment. Yes, it's important to know the data that's out there, but most of the important things, you weren't going to find the opportunity for the iPhone in data. And I told you the story that when the Haloid Corporation came up with the copy machine and went to Arthur D. Little to say, how big is the United States market for copy machines? They said 100. So market research, of course, maybe that speaks to the limits of market research, and there is precision and there's false precision. So yes, it's good to have data if it's good data, and if it's reliable, if it actually measures the thing that you're trying to get your handle on. But what data would have helped Steve Jobs figure out the opportunity, the latent demand for the iPhone? What would help Lee Iacocca figure out what the demand would be for the Chrysler minivan? What market study? You get focal groups together and they could probably tell you something about what it is they'd like, but until they actually have something in their hand, they're not necessarily going to be able to imagine what the technology can deliver. And that's why when Xerox started to commercialize the Xerox machine, they didn't sell it. They had a rental model. Why did they have a rental model? Because they knew if you tried to sell these things, no one would buy them. But if you said, hey, why don't you try it? And it's going to cost you, 5 cents per copy, and that's all you have to come up with. You got through that cognitive barrier, and then they started using it. The same thing with myself. I wasn't the first to get a cell phone. I thought that a mobile phone, that was a bit of a waste of money. But as soon as I had one, I started using it a hell of a lot more than I ever thought I would. And now I can't live without one. So you do learn through engagement with technology, and market surveys don't take into account that type of learning.
All right,
Any more?
so
Yeah.
let's see. So it's 9 o'clock. We have one raised hand and one in the chat. So we could proceed, or we could pick those up either asynchronously or next week.
So let's have the questions, and then we'll finish with these two questions.
Right. Okay. So first in the chat from Ashwin is, do you see value in Porter's value chain analysis?
Oh, well, that's something different. I never quite understood. Clearly, there's a value chain. But I don't know, there was some good parts to be in the value chain. I never understood what the heck he was trying to say with the value chain analysis. Maybe you can tell me. But I think it was a bunch of rubbish, to tell you the truth. I mean, look, there are value chains. Finding out where the bottlenecks in the value chain are very important. That's what you're going to be introduced to, a framework I call profiting from innovation, which says that whenever there's innovation, the money goes not necessarily to the inventor, it goes to the bottleneck in the value chain. There could be the technology, it could be distribution, could be the intellectual property, could be a complement, it can be anywhere. So I never understood what Porter was trying to say, and to the extent to which I invested in it, I never found anything in it that I thought helped me understand the technology sector and areas of the economy that were shaping the future of the economy. So send me an email again with that question, because I would love to give you a better answer. Next question.
Great. Yes. And I think the last one is John, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll try to be crisp. I know we're at time. I'm a second year EW. I work in corporate development strategy for Twitter. I totally understand your point on the dated industrial environment that underpinned 5 forces and why dynamic capabilities would be more relevant today. And I agree with you about Harvard. I guess what my question is trying to understand is why these two models are mutually exclusive. So the word dynamic to me implies an adaptability based on the external environment with feedback loops between market participants and market forces. So if we're going to develop capabilities that are dynamic with respect to that environment, don't we need to understand that environment in order to determine which capabilities we develop? And if, as Porter's 5 forces just a tool to try to understand the external environment better, and if it's a poor one, are there alternatives you recommend?
Well, look, before the class is over, I will show you a diagram where I actually do try and find a place to fit the 5 forces in. But that said, the fundamental question that Michael Porter is trying to address is a good question, which is, how do you assess competition? Does new entry have something to do with it? Of course it does. Does power of buyers and suppliers have something to do with it? Of course they do. Does competition from rivals matter? Of course it does. But other than saying that, what's missed? Innovation is missed. The role of complements. In today's world of platforms, complements are as powerful a force of competition as a direct head-to-head competitor. In fact, they're more powerful because they can surprise you. My example was, did Disney think that Netflix was a competitor or a complementer? Overnight they become a competitor. Maybe you get 6 months notice, that that's the direction of travel. But who thought that Amazon would be making movies, and who thought that Netflix would be making movies when they were just putting, DVDs in a box a few years ago and then distributing them on the internet? The complementers become competitors. So at minimum, there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 forces, and don't look inside the industry. So if you had to fix the 5 forces, you'd go from 5 to N forces, and you would drop the industry. Other than that, it's fine, I suppose. The problem is it makes you think that if you looked at the 5 forces, you've finished your job. And you've only just started it. In fact, you've gotten a false sense of security because you think there's only 5 forces and you think you only have to look inside the industry. So if you really want your competitors to be using the 5 forces, and then you know what their blind spot is. All right, is there one more question, Ian, or did we get through the list?
Let's see. So there is a request, which we could do next week, for a example case or scenario between the angle of 5 forces and dynamic capabilities to appreciate the difference.
Okay, well, let's leave that till next week. Actually, it's a good challenge. I've never sat down to do that. So I've been throwing stones long enough that is time for me to do something like that. So anyone wants to help me out, that'd be great. But I will come back with something.
Great.
Now, for next class, we're going a little slower through this than I thought, but this is the essence, just to come back. We're now giving you the dynamic capabilities framework. Everything else in the class is to convince you that that is the right worldview. I've tried to sneak it in on you under the radar screen without it being too controversial. Now I'm going through the business of exposing to you that it's actually a controversial view and not something you should readily accept. What I'm hoping to persuade you is that you should accept it, and then you will see that the cognitive frameworks that a lot of other people use, not business people from Silicon Valley because they live and breathe this, but people that are not from Silicon Valley and don't understand the kind of environment that exists out here, they're still steeped in the wrong cognitive frameworks. And then when we get into public policy, we'll find that nobody in public policy has any clue about the true nature of competition, including the competition agencies themselves. There's a little hyperbole in what I've said, but sometimes I'll excuse myself if I use hyperbole because I'm trying to get points across for purposes of exciting your emotions and bringing forth questions. So in due course, I will admit to when I've been a little bit hyperbolic. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention. And I'm glad we didn't have too many audio breaks or anything like that. I think the high school should perhaps give you all a decent microphone so you don't have to rely on the mics in your laptops, because at least by the time it gets through the speakers here in this room, it's not as clear as it should be. But I'm glad Ian has got headphones on, so he's got a higher fidelity than I have and can translate through some of your questions. So thank you all. The readings, we still got the same set of readings, which is Next Generation Competition. I'll go through that rather fast because we've been actually biting into quite a bit of that substance. And we'll spend some time on the role of intangible assets because that's also a key part of the story here in dynamic capabilities. So look forward to seeing you next week. Good night.
Great. Okay, and there was a question about the midterm, and so we'll have info on that in terms of format, estimated dates, so forth, either next week or in advance of next week. So pay attention to that in the announcements section in B courses, as well as we'll have info on that the next class session.
Thank
So
you, Ian.
stay tuned to the announcements,
Great.
and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.